From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's 12 exchanges and 6 clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
You think of the New York Stock Exchange and you might think about industrial stocks like Ford, recalling its founder, Henry Ford, maybe big tech stocks like Dell Technologies, named for its founder, Michael Dell, or mammoth retail stocks like Walmart, hearkening back to Sam Walton himself. Then there's stocks that speak to a very way of life. There's Levi Strauss & Company, for example. That's NYSE ticker symbol LEVI. Or Nordstrom Inc., that's NYSE ticker symbol JWN. These are the names that have clothed America for centuries. John W. Nordstrom was born in the Swedish town of Alvik, emigrating here at the age of 16, arriving on America's shores with $5 to his name, making a fortune in the Alaska gold rush, and settling in Seattle to go into the shoe business in 1901. At last check, JWN had a market cap of $5.5 billion. Today we're talking about another great American story about our way of life, NYSE ticker symbol RL for Ralph Lauren Corporation. Its current market cap of $7.7 billion, founded from nothing by a guy who thought he could make better neckties for the American gentleman. You get a sense of what Ralph's obsession with ties turned into on a walk on the Upper East Side, looking at the corner of East 72nd Street and Madison Avenue. Sitting there is the Gertrude Rhinelander Waldo House, or the Rhinelander Mansion, as it's often called. Modeled after a Loire Valley chateau, you can imagine it housing descendants of Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, or Morgans, recalling the sensibilities of early 20th century America while remaining rooted firmly in the present. Walk in the door and you're engulfed by the timeless vision that belongs to Ralph Lauren at his flagship store. This month, Home Box Office, the premium channel of AT&T, that's NYSE ticker symbol T, is premiering Very Ralph, accompanied by the tagline, An Extraordinary Life by Design. It's part of a fall crop of documentary films from one of the most prolific providers of that genre of filmmaking that this season will bring us The Bronx, USA, Saudi Women's Driving School, Liberty, Mother of Exiles, and Torn Apart, Separated at the Border. Add to this list Very Ralph, the story of a man many believe is America's greatest ever designer over a career that spanned more than 50 years. About the mansion that oozes his worldview, Ralph once said, "This store is the essence of everything that I've done since my first necktie. I want this to be more than a store. I'm not just selling clothes, I'm selling a world, a notion of style." Joining us in the library of the New York Stock Exchange is Susan Lacy, the director and producer of the HBO documentary Very Ralph. We'll discuss this behind-the-scenes look at Ralph Lauren and the art of documentary filmmaking right after this.
The U.S. is now one of the world's largest oil exporters, as its high-quality crude fulfills strong global demand. The ICE Permian WTI offering provides a complete solution for traders with export and pricing efficiency. With delivery in Houston, the futures contract offers unblended crude direct from the Permian Basin. Upon delivery, storage of Permian WTI is available at the terminal, providing exporters with transparent pricing and the ability to plan crude movements. Permian WTI barrels can be moved directly to the water, sending a quality U.S. crude to the global market. ICE, a global oil complex designed for the commercial trader.
When it comes to storytelling, Susan Lacy is a master. The creator and executive producer of American Masters on PBS for nearly 30 years, she oversaw the production and national broadcast of about 215 documentary films highlighting the cultural and artistic giants who have shaped our nation, helping to earn that series 71 Emmy nominations, 28 Emmy wins, in addition to 12 Peabody Awards, 3 Grammy Awards, an Academy Award, and 4 Academy Award nominations. In 2013, Susan made the jump from public television to independent filmmaking, creating her own company, Pentimento Productions, and in 2017 she produced Spielberg, 2018 Jane Fonda in 5 acts, and Very Ralph, premiering on November 12th, will mark her 3rd documentary for HBO Documentary Films. Susan, welcome inside the Ice House.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Before we turn our sights to Ralph Lauren and your work at HBO, let's reflect on American Masters, a favorite spot of mine on a PBS station near you. Some of your executive producer credits include works on Merle Haggard, Janis Joplin, Willie Nelson, Joan Baez. Can we pause for a moment to appreciate that series and now what Ken Burns and Dayton and Duncan have done with their country music series?
Well, when I started the series, my goal was to create a library of American cultural history. At that time in the 20th century, I didn't realize we were going to go into the 21st century. Primarily because it wasn't a series that found a terribly receptive audience at the beginning. Not the audience, the television audience. It was difficult to convince PBS that this was a series that would find an audience. They tended to look at arts profiles as things you put on Sunday afternoon. They didn't see it as prime time. I did. And I saw these stories as incredible stories of people who are, in most cases, when they're changing the landscape of the fields that they are in, they're overcoming obstacles, whether it's the tradition of whatever was there before, finding a way to bring it to people, fighting their own demons. I mean, these are ultimately very transcendent stories and very dramatic. So I want to make that series, and I wanted to make real movies about it. So I always looked at, music, and I would divide it into jazz and R&B and country and classical, rock. Songwriters were always of great interest to me. I come from a musical family. I mean, and in addition to the, literature and dance and photography and architecture and all those fields. So I think we chose well. In terms of the people that we've made, that I was involved in making films about in the country vein. There are always more to do. If you were going to write the book on the most important country music singers and American country music singers, who would the chapter headings be? And it would pop out. I mean, it wasn't a genius to choose the people that I chose. They were chosen because they had a body of work that was important and stories that were important to tell.
You were also executive producer of Judy, Garland by Myself, and this fall's star turn by Renee Zellweger in Judy brought both this triumphant and tragic figure back to the screen. How does the documentarian view the work of the biopic directors of the lives of Johnny Cash or Ray Charles and the acting talents of Joaquin Phoenix and Jimmy Fox in a way that we appreciate these lives brought through a dramatic filming and script versus the documentary approach?
Well, I also directed and produced the Judy Garland film because she was somebody that I executive produced all of the films in American Masters, and I chose to direct some of them. And that was one I wanted very much to direct because I was a huge fan. And I felt that her story had been just so misrepresented over the years that what people were going to remember about her, and it was her great fear that people would remember that she was a woman who had an alcohol problem who didn't show up. And it was so not the truth. She was the hardest working woman in Hollywood. And whatever her troubles were brought on by Hollywood and some not very kind people who were using her. She did 32 movies before she was 24 years old. I mean, I may have that a little bit wrong, but that's what I remember in my mind. And then she was fired from Annie Get Your Gun. And it almost destroyed her. And she had to fight her way back. And she did it by taking control of her own career. and she put together that incredible movie, Star is Born. She found the writers, she found the songwriters, she hired George Cukor, and the only reason that, and it was great, and the only reason she didn't win the Oscar is because the studio didn't have confidence that an audience could sit through a film that was that long, so they, without telling her, just cut it, edited it, so that there's scenes that didn't make sense. Ultimately, that movie got restored, and as much of the original as they could put in. But occasionally, if you watch the fully restored version of it, there'll be photographs. But the sound was there. It was very interesting to see the actual movie compared to what people saw in the movie theater. And as George Cukor says in my film, she was robbed of her Oscar. It's funny that you say that about Johnny Cash and Ray Charles, and I could add Truman Capote to that. I always said that I felt that these stories were great movies.
Yeah.
And we would get calls all the time after one of our movies. But, we got a call once from Marlon Brando, who would ask for our films. George Clooney called and asked for our Edward R. Murrow. He then made Good Night and Good Luck.
Yeah.
So I always take a little pride in the fact that we kind of led the way in showing that these were movie-worthy stories. And now it's de rigueur. But, there was always the occasional Life of Louis Pasteur, kind of movie that Hollywood did in the 40s. But genuinely authentic films that really looked at the real story. Those, there were always Hollywood versions, and I think we kind of led the way and see people saying, you can actually tell the story, and they're complex, and they are sometimes dark, and you want that transcendent moment, which we hope happens, doesn't always.
So now on to some of the American lives that you've revealed in documentary form, Spielberg and Fonda, and now Lauren. Let's introduce our audience to your latest work, Very Ralph.
He's becoming bigger and bigger, and they always pointed out that he was from the Bronx and his real name was Lifshitz. It was like, who's he to tell us how to dress up?
Some of the criticism was very painful. Oh my God, maybe I think I'm good, but I'm not.
There was a certain point in the very early days where Ralph almost lost the whole business.
I remember so scared. I'm not gonna let this happen. I'm gonna make it back. 50 years back and forth on the runway. You're rolling the dice again and again and again.
Fashion has to be desirable, and Ralph sees that and understands that.
You have to have a full life to be able to create. You can't create from emptiness.
Fashion, it sounds like a frivolous thing and it's not important. But I think it's important that people express who they are.
Susan, I wish I could play clips from the entirety of the movie because it's wonderful, and I've screened it already. When it came time to look at Ralph Lauren as a subject, what were your thoughts as you look back at this 50-year professional career, not to say anything about his upbringing in the Bronx?
Well, I think I should tell you that when I was at American Masters, if I were going to do a fashion person, and I always wanted to, it would have been Ralph Lauren, for obvious reasons. He's the most American of designers. It's an American story. But it didn't happen. So when I made the move over to HBO, and Richard Plepler, who's the head of HBO until very recently, and a wonderful man, asked me if I'd be interested in doing a film on Ralph Lauren. I was like, yeah, I would love to do that. But the truth is I didn't know that much about him. I just knew, the way I was thinking about how I choose my subjects, he seems like the right guy. If you're going to do a fashion person in America, he's the guy. But I didn't know that much about him. I knew what everybody knows, or we imagine that he was born like Ralph Lifshitz, and he was in the Bronx, and he started with ties and built an empire. That's pretty much what I knew. And he made beautiful clothes, kind of timeless, classic clothes. So when I started looking into the story, and I was really gobsmacked at what a pioneer he was. I had no idea. Because you think of him as, these very classic clothes, not particularly pioneering fashion person. And then to find out that he was the first one to champion diversity on the runway and in ads. He was the first one to have a store in a store. Now everybody has a store in a store. He was the first one to have a freestanding store. Now everybody has their own store. Madison Avenue didn't look like Madison Avenue until the Rhinelander Mansion went up. And then it completely metamorphosized. He was the first one to understand how important branding was. Nobody knew about branding. I mean, Calvin Klein says it in the film. The rest of us were thinking about our next collection. He was thinking about his brand. He was the first one to do extensive ad campaigns that might be 17 pages, in the New York Times. He was the first one to move into lifestyle. I mean, I could go on, and that was just amazing to me. And it couldn't help with storytelling, because he isn't a fashion designer that does all the traditional things that fashion designers do. He doesn't sew, and he doesn't draw, and he doesn't sketch, and he doesn't drape. So it was wonderful to have all those things to put into the mix of telling his story, including where he came from and how he saw the world, a different world, that the one that he grew up in. And that fueled it all. I mean, that fueled everything. The movies fueled it all.
If you think of all of your filmography, so much focus on musicians, filmmakers, artists, you mentioned that the world of fashion was one that you had wanted to tackle and you hadn't had a chance to, I guess, until this. What was your process of boning up and getting smart on all these issues?
Well, I spend an enormous amount of time getting ready for these films. I mean, overkill. I read everything. In addition to whatever's written about Ralph, I try to understand what else is going on as he's coming up so that I have a context for what he fit into, what was new and different. I mean, I think carefully about who I'm going to interview. They're obvious choices, the family. And a lot of times I've made films where I don't interview the family at all. But in his case, it was essential because the family is so much a part of the image of Ralph Lauren. And I don't just mean his own family, but families. And, his wife was his muse.
Ricky's his muse, yeah.
One of his sons works with him. It was just natural. His brother Jerry is in the business. Then I really looked at, I asked Paul Goldberger because he had written an amazing piece in Esquire that was so insightful, and I learned so much from it. It really influenced my thinking. So I wanted him, Judith Thurman, who's the longtime fashion writer for New Yorker, Anna Wintour, for obvious reasons, some other famous models, Calvin, Donna. I mean, some of it was very obvious. But then I saw this archive footage with Tom Brokaw doing one of the first interviews that Ralph did, and I thought, well, that'd be great to interview him because he had a great story to tell.
I mean, he was a journalist who didn't want to look like a guy attired in Brooks Brothers.
He didn't want to look like his father. Right. He didn't want to wear the same suits his father wore. Woody I picked because he is a friend. Ralph dressed him in Annie Hall. He did not dress Annie Hall. And he doesn't take credit for dressing Annie Hall. He says that was all Diane Keaton that came right out of her closet. But he did dress Woody Allen. And when Woody Allen had to go to events or something, he'd call Ralph. And Ralph would take him to his closet because they were kind of the same size. There's so many stories I had to leave out.
Were you at all conflicted about including Woody in the film, given some of the noise about Woody over the last couple of years?
I wasn't. I thought about it, and I thought he has interesting, insightful things to say. He knows him well, and there was a connection with the movies that I thought was kind of important.
I mean, talking about the movies, in the film, Ralph describes his love of old Hollywood and his love of films. You include so many beautiful black and white clips from, Desire, Pride of the Yankees, The Gay Divorcee. You've talked very clearly about his cinematic approach to everything. Did that help you in shaping how you were going to edit and create in the finished product?
Sure. Gave me some wonderful visuals to work with, and I could make the connection between what he was seeing as a young man growing up in the Bronx and exposure to worlds he would never have known. Glamorous penthouse life, the great open spaces of the West, cowboys, horses, yachting life, English country life, So having the movies to work with was fun, but also, as I said, I was able to make the connection between the worlds he saw and the worlds he then created, because it all started with the movies, and it's a big theme. And, I was also very attracted to to the fact that he comes from an immigrant family, and Hollywood movies were invented by immigrants to this country who created an idealized look at a vision of America that is the one that influenced him. And to some degree, Ralph has created an idealized vision of America that comes from that. So obviously there were some wonderful structural connections here.
You have Ken Burns saying, in another era, he would have been one of the great producers that Hollywood ever created.
I think he had visions, maybe, of being a filmmaker. And he says that very clearly. I would have loved to have made movies. I wanted to make movies. I wanted to be the star of my own movie, which he's extremely open about.
And he ultimately did that in the form of 60-second spots.
Exactly. Or these extended ad campaigns,
yes,
which were very cinematic in their vision. I love the way Tina Brown talks about that in the film. And also Anna. A lot of people talk about his cinematic vision, and he saw it the same way. Didn't you love that moment where one of his favorite models, Tim, I can't remember his last name, but he's wonderful, says that he would give them backstories. Tim, this is your house, and you just inherited it, but you don't want the rest of the family to know. And he said by the time you start shooting, you believe all this stuff. So he is telling stories through he says, I write through my clothes, and he's telling stories through these ads. So he got to exercise that muscle.
Telling one kind of a story. You have Goldberger saying, nobody's drunk, they want the world to be right.
Well, I mean, that's the comparison with the 30s and the 40s movies where everybody's drinking champagne, but ultimately somebody throws a champagne in somebody's face. That doesn't exist. It doesn't happen in Ralph Lauren world. It's and I think Paul's so good in the film. He says, he understands that the people don't necessarily always want edge. They want the world to be right, and he understood that. He's not trying to break the mold. He's not trying to be hard-edged or teach us a lesson.
So now to the title of the film, because you have Paul Goldberger is such an important historian and tour guide for us. He writes in the New York Times in 1992, it is perhaps the ultimate accolade, not merely to have your name known, but to have it become an adjective. Memories feel Proustian, music feels Mozartian, and clothing, linens, furniture, and even whole rooms can be very Ralph Lauren. How did you choose the film's title and also its jumping off point?
Well, there were a couple of things. One was that quote, which I start the film with over, just a little bit of buzzy music, because I thought it was wonderful. And then, of course, there's Audrey Hepburn, who presented him with the Lifetime Achievement Award and did a beautiful description of what Ralph Lauren conjures up all the things that mean a lot to me, she said. And then she rattles them off. And then she says, and when someone says, very Ralph Lauren, you know exactly what they mean. And I've grown up with that, understanding, I've heard people say it. You wear a certain kind of jacket, and people say, it's so Ralph Lauren. It's so very Ralph. It's almost impossible to say exactly what that means. It's something you just see and understand. And as Paul says, you get it viscerally. It's a certain look. It's a certain way of putting things together. It is a very romanticized view of not only the world, but of, environments. Everything is perfect. Everything is perfect. I think very Ralph probably means sort of a certain kind of perfection.
Extensive use of archival family footage. I'm curious, what did you learn about Ralph as you dove into his past and also explored his present life? The man is now 80 years old, but you have him really at the very youngest moments as he's striving to be accepted and successful in the New York fashion circles. You've got the big breakthrough at Bloomingdale's, but you really went behind the scenes with him.
Well, you mean in terms of watching him work today? That wasn't so easy to get agreement on. I'm very grateful that he did, and I think he understands why. He actually trusted me. I mean, I don't know if you know enough about Ralph to know that there's never been a film about him. He's never participated in a book about him. He's actually controlled every single thing that he's ever been involved with. And it was clear from the beginning, Richard Plepler and I said, you can't control this. And he gulped hard and went with it. And I give him a lot of credit for that, for trusting me and trusting HBO to tell the story and not try to interfere with it, not try to meddle with it, not try to control it in any way. So when I said, I really would like to shoot you at work today, and he said, well, I look so much better in the archive footage. Why don't you just use that? I mean, like everyone else, you know, we like the way we looked when we were younger.
Is the archive footage a personal family holding or is it a corporate holding?
No, it's you know, he would document every runway show and he would do an interview afterwards, but he was hiring the filmmaker. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, that's all great, and I want to use it because we want to see you over the years, and some of it's wonderful, but I'm so inspired by the fact that you still go to work every day. And you're just as passionate and involved as you were from the beginning. I think other people are going to be inspired by that too. Please let me show that. And he did. And it was wonderful. I think it's a wonderful part of the film to see him working today, getting ready for the 50th anniversary show as if it was his first. But what I learned about him that was surprising, first of all, that he's really has a wonderful sense of humor, that he loves to dance, that he has this really cut-up side to him, and I was so grateful that they allowed me to use the family movies, home movies. I was so grateful for that because that's a Ralph that nobody sees except his family. And I just loved it. I loved that he wanted to be Frank Sinatra, and he would, you know, sing with a wooden spoon. But I also learned that he is just as human as the rest of us. He's humble. And he's just as human. That I'm nervous every single time I go out there is true. And not everyone maintains that sense of I hope I'm going to be as good as I was the last time.
I mean, you have this footage, and I'm not sure where it's from, but it shows a younger Ralph Lauren and one of his sons playing pickup basketball in a backyard, schoolyard somewhere, certainly not any very highfalutin place, and you have him maybe telling you, or quoted somewhere, we weren't very social, he says, of his life with Ricky. I wanted to be home with my family, and they drive past in the Hamptons, you know, these long lines of cars where there's valet parking, and he says, well, I guess they forgot about us, Ricky. I mean, this is really a person who, you know, leaves it all out there at the show, but at the end of the day, he wants to be curled up on the sofa. Yeah, very much so. I mean, he, without question, prefers the company of his family and his close colleagues. Some of them have been with him for 50 years to anything else. But what I love about it, I do feel like he opened up with me in a way that he probably doesn't on camera, I mean, as ever before, when he said, you know, I mean, I guess they forgot about us, Ricky. And he said, but, you know, like, hey, you want to still be invited. You may not always want to go, but, you know, you still want to be invited. I thought that was just so revealing. I want to hear a clip of Ralph accepting an award last year from the CFDA, that's the Council of Fashion Designers of America.
I don't know if I ever call myself a designer. I never look for titles. I love what I do. I loved what I did. I started making neckties out of a drawer in the Empire State Building. I delivered them myself. My wife and father-in-law helped sew on labels. I know what it is to start, and I know what it is to enjoy success. And I also know that this industry is not easy, that business and the business world is complicated.
The business world is complicated. That is not a clip from your film, Susan, because if it was, you'd have this incredible soundtrack behind it and all these wonderful sounds that you put into it in the editing room. But what were your impressions of the business that you found yourself covering, the one that I mentioned in the introduction? Fashion today finds itself challenged by changing style tastes, fewer people wearing the ties that Ralph used as his signature accessory.
Well, I am no expert on the fashion business at all and don't pretend to be. I think it's a very fickle world. So for me, the fact that Ralph has lasted for 50 years, and I think this is true, I think he and Armani are the last two remaining designers who still run the companies that bear their name. That's kind of amazing and not easy to do in a very fickle industry. I think that fashion, like media, like everything, has been challenged by and changed by the internet. I mean, people don't go into stores as much. People buy everything off the internet. I mean, not everything, but I mean, it's got to have challenged the same way that we're worried about whether movie theaters are going to remain standing. I mean, many of us care about that a lot. I think that that's a challenge, and I think that Ralph Lauren's company has tried to meet that challenge, and they have very strong internet presence. I don't think Ralph Lauren is going anywhere. I mean, I don't think the business is going anywhere. You know, the vicissitudes of the business, I think and everybody has to deal with. And I really don't understand enough about the ups and downs and all that. But I do know when he went public, he was a little worried that, you know, having stockholders was going to somehow affect his ability to sustain the vision that he had. And I think Anna Wintour says it really, really, really well. Ralph has kept his vision strong, and he has not strayed from it. There have been people who've tried to make him or suggest he change it. There's been a kind of revolving door in the last few years over at Ralph Lauren, executives in, executives out. But she said he's not getting off that train, and he's kept his vision strong. And I think that's the key to the success of the Ralph Lauren company, is it has a singular, strong vision, and it hasn't strayed from it. And he's committed to it.
There's a singular, strong vision for your movie as well, and one of the threads that is woven throughout it from beginning to end is the musical score. Sometimes it's instrumental, sometimes it's songs that we know and love. I've Got the World on a String by Frank Sinatra. So how do you think of how to put together a film and all of the options available to you? You said you're from a family of musicians. You've covered and made films about musicians in the past. This is a 108-minute film that has music from beginning to end, a monumental aspect in itself.
I know. I love working with music. Most of the films I've directed have been about musicians, but I knew this needed to be scored, and that there were going to be a few songs that would set, you know, sort of period pieces. Actually, at the end, there are very few. I knew when I did the home movie sequence to kind of show this other side of Ralph that I wanted a Frank Sinatra song, obviously. And I was very lucky that I have a relationship with Nancy Sinatra. And I called her up and I said, I need to have a Frank Sinatra song. You got to work with me on this because, you know, it's not so easy clearing some of these things.
Yeah.
And so I listened and listened and listened. I knew it had to be Frank Sinatra, and I went, oh God, it's got to be I've Got to Roll on a String. I mean, and I didn't want Ralph to know about it. So when the lawyer called me, because I've known the Sinatra people over the years for all kinds of reasons, and he called me and he said, we just need to make sure, Ralph, you know, we know you, Susan, and we know this, but we just want to make sure that he's blessing this film. And I said, well, can you just wait just wait a little while, because I don't want him to know that I've got this song in the film, because I want him to be surprised by it. And he said, okay. But because I thought he'd get a kick out of it.
At the end of the film, we are taken inside Ralph Lauren's Evening in Central Park, a fashion show and event celebrating the 50th anniversary of the company's founding. I couldn't help but notice there's Steven Spielberg in the front row for the show, and you've covered Spielberg too, done a film about him. He keeps a famously low profile, as does Ralph Lauren. When you finally did screen it for Ralph with Sinatra and everything else, what were the reactions?
He cried. He had tears going down his face. And I did too. It's an emotional experience, and it's very intimate. I'm terrified that he's not going to be happy. He's terrified that he's not going to be happy. You know, I mean, there's that, you know, a little bit of tension there. Is you know, did I do a good job? And is he going to be pleased with the way I told his story? But I think it was very moving for him to see his life in front of him and children when they were younger. And, you know, it's the equivalent of your life flowing, you know, in front of you. And it's hard at first to see a movie about yourself. He didn't see it till it was finished. And I always show my films to my I hate to call them my subjects because they become so important to me, but a few days before I'm locking picture in case there's something they really, really, really hate. And it's something that's easy to give in on, because you don't want them to wince every time they see the film. And mostly it has to do with appearance. It's very rarely about anything editorial. Really don't like that shot of me and or something. And I relate to that because I'm at an age now, if somebody takes a picture of me, I want to see it first. And if I don't like it, I trash it. So I was okay with that. We made a few photo swap outs, and that was about it. But it was an emotional experience.
I mean, you mentioned that you had a tear as well. And I'm wondering if you look back at all the films you've made for American Masters and the films you're making now for HBO, is that reflected in a sense that here we are in 2019 and the world has so changed and it is not that ideal that we had in the 80s and 90s looking at those ads?
Well, the film ends a little bit with, right before the 50th anniversary there, a couple of the top Pulitzer Prize winning fashion journalists are saying, can the narratives upon which this brand was built, anyone can enter the American dream, may not be so true anymore. So, yes, there's that is part of it, and part of it is also that I thought it was a beautiful love story. I think that this marriage, and also that Ralph was able to say to me, sometimes I've realized my dreams. I live the life I had envisioned. And sometimes you get to an age where you go, I don't need all the things I thought I needed. What I really need is that simple little barn over there and my family and my wife. And I was very moved by that. And he told me that story 3 times. And he wasn't doing it to, he didn't even realize that it was affecting me the way it affected me. And I knew I wanted to end the film with that story because I think that's the real Ralph, When his mother says, what do you need all this for? What do you need to buy Hyde Park, in Bedford, New York? And he said, well, I really got it because I like that little barn over there, because that's for my soul. And I thought that's the real Ralph. So I was moved by that.
I was moved, as we talked about a little bit before we started recording, of the passage when he is really facing financial peril earlier in his career, and he is basically told by his financial advisors and bankers that you're going to be out of business, we're going to shut you down. And his greatest fear is actually having to
tell his father,
go to his dad.
Yeah, I was very moved by that. Because, I do a lot of interviews, and I kind of try to break it down and try to get past the story he might have told before and get into some, or any of my people that I make films about. And that was when I said, it must have been really tough. Early on, you almost lost your business. They hadn't planned well. They didn't have enough money in the bank, didn't have the right bankers. They grew too fast, and they simply couldn't keep up with the demand, and they were about to fold. I think Buffy, who's been with Beratelli, who's been with him for about 50 years, said they couldn't even meet payroll. And we never think about Ralph Lauren that way. We think of him as this, unbridled, from nowhere to the mountaintop with no adversities in between. And there was that one. And so I was very touched that he was able to tell me the truth. The truth about that is that he was most worried about telling his father. I thought that was so touching.
And then how do you, as the filmmaker, bring that home? Because you have his voice saying that, but you're also editing in this ethereal picture of New York. You can tell me what year or date it was. It looked like the 80s enveloped in fog.
Well, because when he told the story, he said it was a rainy day, and I was determined to get my business back. And he said, I don't know why, but I put on a white suit because it was a rainy day. I don't know why I would wear a white suit. And I went out to reclaim my business. I'm not going to lose it. I'm not going to let this happen. So we looked for wonderful rain footage. and I'm so pleased that you commented on it because it was a big search to find what seemed like the right rain footage to show there. We had a couple of things until we found the right one. I have wonderful, wonderful people who work with me and have worked with me for a long time. And they're as unrelenting as I am in finding the right thing. We go under every rock.
We haven't talked much about you, Susan, and the beginnings of your career, but you graduated Phi Beta Kappa from University of Virginia with a BA in American Studies and a Master's in American Studies from George Washington. Did you always have an interest in American history, people, and places?
Yes, that's why I was one of the. I'm not young, and American Studies was really at its birth when I was in college, and I just was drawn to it. I was drawn to the connections, particularly art and particularly in college, literature and architecture, and how they could be, reflected the social and political and cultural milieu of their times. And when I went to, and of course I got a master's degree in it, I also did a lot of all the work for a PhD. I just never wrote a dissertation. Yes, and I thought I was going to be a scholar. Actually, that's what I wanted to do. I loved school. I loved writing papers, and I loved being in the library and all that. I was a serious student. So when I ended up in public television, which was kind of an accident, I was working in a series called Great Performances, and we were doing full-scale ballets and orchestra pieces and theater pieces and dramas, Brideshead Revisited. And I was always interested in the people who actually choreographed it or composed it or wrote it. And so I had this idea, and it came right out of my studies to do a series called American Masters.
You were also editor of your college newspaper, The Bullet. What did you learn in those early days, managing stories, defending controversial decisions that translated into those ultimate roles at PBS and now HBO? Well, I was a very controversial newspaper editor because I was at the Women's College of the University of Virginia. I graduated in 1970, and in the 60s I was, I was from the North, Baltimore, which some people don't consider the North, but I did. And I just, I was part of the anti-war movement. I was part of the radical movement. I was part of, the left. And I ran a pretty lefty newspaper, and I ran controversial issues. One time I had a cover that was a wanted poster of Jesus. And I had all these editorials about Christian radicalism because, it was a weekly paper and there wasn't really much news. So I said, I'm going to make this a thematic newspaper, and we're going to have issues and about gun control and segregation. There was still, when I started there was still segregated housing. And the war, and, what's going on, the military-industrial complex. Anyway, I ran this poster of Jesus, which is, he had a beard, he had long hair, he wore sandals, he preached peace. If he'd been living today, he'd probably be in the SDS and he'd be in jail. Well, this wasn't very popular in the South at the time, so I paid a little bit of a price for that. We lost all our advertising. I had to have a bodyguard, and it got into the newspaper. CBS, I think, a local paper. Anyway, money started pouring in from all over the country to support freedom of the press. Freedom of the press, freedom of creative expression. You've done it now for a long time, both at PBS and now at HBO. As we wrap up, Susan, you see these announcements. There's Netflix, Amazon Prime coming soon to a TV near you, Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus. Thinking about your craft and the places in which it can be exhibited, how are streaming services changing the way you're going to produce films in the future and other documentarians? Well, that's really a big question. I don't really know. I hope it's not going to change the way we make films. I hope it doesn't mean faster, cheaper, and not as good. And one of the reasons I've been so happy to be at HBO is that they recognize quality, and they recognize that that it takes time and it takes patience to make great television. So I'm hoping that whatever happens in the future, that doesn't affect. Quality is not going to be affected. But I'm not a seer. I don't know. I think we're all waiting to see what happens here. We're all waiting to see what happens. Good luck with Very Ralph. Thank you so much for joining us inside the Ice House. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here. That's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Susan Lacy, producer of Very Ralph, premiering on HBO Tuesday, November 12th at 9 p.m. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or a question you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@theice.com or tweet us at icehousepodcast. Our show is produced by Teresa DeLuca and Pete Ash, with production assistance from Ken Abel and Stephen Romanchik. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the Library of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.